The room has not aged well. 26 years of stillness have settled into the drywall, the floorboards, the thin film of dust that softens every sharp corner. The air carries the faint odor of old paper and the metallic whisper of forgotten rainwater that leaked through the roof seasons ago. It is the kind of place where time does not simply pause, it congeals, trapping the last moment of a life like a photograph left to fade in a box no one meant to open again. The investigator stands just inside the doorway, letting the silence press against him, steady and blank, as if the house itself is holding its breath. The memory of that night feels close enough to touch, but it resists him, slipping away like light around a shutter. He steps forward anyway. It is late autumn in rural Kentucky, a stretch of land where the hills roll in quiet, worn-out patterns and the wind moves with a tired rhythm. In 1999, a woman named Leora Maddox, 24 years old, soft-voiced, working evenings at a county archive office, lived in this house. She had a fondness for thrift store books, a habit of scribbling observations in the margins, and a calmness that made people trust her more than they intended. She vanished on a cold Thursday night. 2 days later, she was found here on her own kitchen floor, her life reduced to a scene investigators couldn't decipher. No forced entry, no signs of struggle, no clear motive, just a quiet home that had swallowed its last witness. The case file grew heavy with interviews, photographs, and contradictions until it finally collapsed under its own weight. With no workable evidence, the county declared it unsolved. The home was emptied. The investigation cooled. People moved on. But the unresolved absence of a reason, a pattern, a truth, carved itself into local memory. For years, Leora became a name spoken softly, more out of habit than hope. Now in the present, the investigator, Daniel Keene, 53, steady, understated, steps back into the same room he surveyed as a young deputy. His posture carries neither triumph nor dread, only a quiet responsibility. The ghosts here are procedural, but they still carry the shape of a mistake. Something missed, something overlooked, something that should not have stayed buried this long. Keene walks to the center of the room, boots pressing lightly against the floor as though any sound might shatter the fragile air. He kneels near the spot marked long ago in faded chalk. The house offers no protest, no creak, just silence, thick and observant. He whispers, almost reflexively, to no one in particular. Leora. The word barely forms, dissolving into dust. The case remains suspended in this moment. A room that never left 1999, an investigator who never stopped replaying the dead ends, and a question that has waited far too long for an honest answer. The suspense lingers like a breath held in the lungs of the entire house. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. 1,000 words. It began 3 weeks earlier, before Keene found himself once again standing in the forgotten kitchen. The reopening of Leora's case did not arrive with fanfare, only a small, unassuming email forwarded through procedural channels. Attached was a scanned photo from a storage audit at the county evidence warehouse, one cardboard box mislabeled in 2001, rediscovered by a clerk who was reorganizing shelves for digitization. Inside the box was a single undeveloped film canister, sealed in a plastic sleeve. The canister shouldn't have existed. The chain of custody logs listed no such item, but the handwriting on the label, black ink, slightly smudged, was unmistakably from the era. The note read, Maddox House, Roll 3, unprocessed. The rediscovery set off a quiet chain reaction. Keene received the email at 6:42 a.m. and sat staring at the thumbnail image for several long seconds. He remembered only 2 rolls of film being submitted in 1999. He remembered the scene photographer arguing about low visibility, about needing more angles, but no third roll. No missing documentation. No clerical slip. And yet there it was. He drove to the warehouse before it opened, flashed his badge with an apologetic nod, and followed the clerk to the box. He lifted the canister with careful fingers. It felt impossibly light, weightless, as if it contained only the absence of all the answers the case never had. The roll was sent to the lab that afternoon. It took 6 days for the images to be processed. 6 days during which an old case file was slid from storage, opened, and spread across Keene's desk like a map of an abandoned town. 6 days in which he felt a familiar pressure returning behind his ribs, a restrained, professional guilt that never truly dissipated. When the film results finally arrived, they were simple, 7 photographs. Most were duplicates of known angles. The entryway, the countertop where Leora's keys were neatly placed, the narrow hallway with peeling paint. But the 7th image, the final one, was different. Grainy, slightly unfocused, taken from a low angle near the floor. It captured the corner of the kitchen wall where a faint smear of discoloration had been ignored as water damage. But under digital enhancement, the smear revealed a faint circular imprint, not natural, not accidental. A pattern, a shape. Something pressed there by human hands, or by an object held close to the wall. This was the missing piece. Not dramatic, not violent, not obvious, but unmistakably intentional. Keene stared at the enlargement for a long time. The imprint resembled the curve of something circular, a metal ring, perhaps, or a tool, or the edge of a handled object. It was not something Leora would have pressed against her own wall. The angle was too odd, the position too deliberate. It suggested someone had been here with her, someone standing close enough to brace themselves, someone who may have pressed the object against the wall in a moment of tension or restraint. This was no longer a passive scene, it was an interrupted one. The new evidence was enough to justify reopening the case. The district office signed the order without argument. Media were not notified. Internal memos remained neutral, procedural. And Keene, without ceremony, reopened the binder that had defined his early career. Now, as he stands in Leora's old kitchen, he carries a printout of the newly discovered photograph. He holds it carefully by the edges. The imprint becomes more unsettling each time he studies it, not because it reveals violence, but because it reveals presence. Someone was here. Someone who left quietly. Someone whose story slipped through the cracks for 26 years. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. 1,000 words. Back at the precinct, Keene sits alone in the evidence review room, its fluorescent lighting sharp and indifferent. Folders are stacked in rows around him, statements, logs, diagrams, transcripts. He opens the oldest report first, smoothing the pages as though ironing the wrinkles of time. Every detail feels heavier now that the 3rd roll has surfaced. He begins reading. Crime Scene Report, November 14, 1999. Primary findings. No forced entry, no stolen items, no signs of long struggle. Temperature in the house slightly lower than expected, possibly due to open window and back room. Mild water damage observed along west kitchen wall. No useful fingerprints beyond household common. Victim found lying near refrigerator, right hand loosely curled inward. He pauses at that last note. The curled hand, he remembers the discussion about it. At the time, pathologists considered it stress-induced, a body's final contraction, nothing more. But now, with the imprint on the wall, its position feels different, as though she had reached for something, or someone before collapsing. He flips to the next document. Interview transcript, neighbor Mrs. Adler. Leora kept to herself. Nice girl, quiet. If she had visitors, I didn't hear them. Keene remembers the tone, elderly, concerned but offering little. He underlines the phrase kept to herself. It appears in multiple interviews, repeated enough to become meaningless. People who keep to themselves often hide small rituals, small worries, small fears that only become relevant long after. Next, he turns to supplemental evidence log. A handwritten note catches his eye, kitchen wall discoloration. Nothing further. No photograph attached. A detail dismissed for lacking threat. He exhales slowly. Missed, not out of negligence but out of the limitations of the time. Film rolls, dim lighting, pressure to produce answers. He continues scanning. A shift occurs around page 74, the arrival of a potential timeline discrepancy. A coworker had stated that Leora left work early on the night of her death, around 8:20 p.m., mentioning she needed to get something sorted at home. But the logs show she purchased groceries at 8:47. Receipts were found in her bag. The discrepancy had seemed trivial then, people change plans. But paired with the imprint on the wall, it hints at something else. She was preparing for someone. Keene writes a note in the margin. Who was expected? The next detail is buried in the property list, a missing library book, checked out under Leora's name, never recovered. The item had been considered irrelevant. Fiction title, no connection. But the book's absence, paired with the impression of a circular object on the wall, something held, something leaned, begins to shift the narrative from accident to encounter. He studies the reports for hours, following every thread. The silence of the room becomes a companion, the soft hum of ventilation steadying his focus. Each page feels like a thin layer of dust being brushed off an old portrait. By late evening, he has a new list. Small, meticulous observations that never fit the original picture. Now, they begin to align, subtly, slowly, forming the edges of something recognizable. Not a revelation. A pattern. A quiet, deliberate presence that moved through Leora's final hours, with intent concealed beneath ordinary gestures. The overlooked details are no longer fragments, they are coordinates. And they point somewhere the original investigation never imagined. The landscape of suspects had once been narrow, even predictable, restricted to those closest to Leora, those who shared proximity rather than genuine conflict. But as Keene revisits the overlooked details, the picture fractures into a wider, more intricate spread of possibilities. Not dramatic characters, not villains, just ordinary people whose ordinary lives concealed quiet tensions. He starts with the name that appears most frequently in the early files, Andrew Klein, her coworker at the county archive office. His statements in 1999 were sparse. He claimed to have spoken to Leora briefly before she left work. She seemed tired, he told investigators. Didn't say much. His alibi, driving to visit his brother an hour out of town, was corroborated by a gas station timestamp, though only partially. The old report notes his demeanor as nervous, uncertain, but that description fits many confronted with tragedy. Keene revisits a detail that had seemed unimportant at the time. Andrew had a habit of borrowing Leora's desk supplies and forgetting to return them. Small objects, pens, clips, a set of labeled index cards. Among the unreturned items was a metal tool she used for archival binding. Circular handle, smooth surface. The kind of object that could leave a faint rounded imprint if pressed into a wall. He circles the note but does not commit to it. Probability is not proof. Next is Mara Delvin, Leora's neighbor on the opposite side of the duplex. Her interviews read as steady, clear. She had been home that night watching television until after midnight. She reported hearing nothing unusual, though admitted her old box fan drowned out most noise. Her only connection to Leora was a brief exchange about a misdelivered mail package 2 weeks prior. Harmless, polite. But Keene studies the transcript again. Mara had described Leora as distracted lately and walking quicker than usual. These small behavioral observations were never followed up. No one asked what might have caused the change, or whether Leora mentioned expecting anyone. In 1999, behavioral nuances rarely outweighed the lack of physical evidence. Mara's motive, if any existed, remains unclear. Nothing ties her directly to the scene except proximity. Still, proximity has gravity. Then there is Jonas Reeve, Leora's older cousin, a mechanic. His relationship with her had been distant but cordial. He claimed to have last seen her at a family gathering 3 weeks before her death. His alibi, working late at an auto shop, was supported by a supervisor who remembered him clocking out at 10:14 p.m., but the shop was only 15 minutes from Leora's home. Keene notes the subtle tension in Jonas's interview. Short answers, averted eyes, not hostile, simply guarded. The original team attributed it to grief. Keene wonders if grief can hide other things too. Another name surfaces deeper in the file. Ellen Vickers, a former classmate of Leora, who had reappeared in her life the previous summer. The two exchanged a handful of letters found in Leora's desk after her death. The letters discuss old memories, a shared project from high school, and an unspoken strain between them. The tone is polite but strained. Ellen was never interviewed. There was no reason to pursue her in 1999. But the missing library book, the one checked out under Leora's name, matched the subject matter that Ellen referenced in her last letter. Symbolism in local folklore. Hand-drawn diagrams. Patterns. Patterns similar to circular impressions. Keene adds Ellen to the list. The list is no longer small. He continues flipping through the pages. A late entry catches his attention. A maintenance worker, Daryl Shaw, who had visited the property 2 days before Leora's death to inspect a faulty water line along the west kitchen wall, the same wall where the imprint was found. His statement had been brief, uninterested, routine. But routine does not guarantee innocence. The original investigators dismissed him due to lack of motive. Keene reads the statement again. Daryl had mentioned Leora seemed preoccupied and kept looking at her phone. She had also asked how long the wall repairs would take, details that hint at anxiety. He wonders whether Daryl saw something he didn't recognize as significant. By the time Keene finishes reviewing the early reports, what once seemed like a tidy circle of leads expands into a web of intersecting lines. None of them obvious. None without gaps. Each person carries motive shaped not by malice but by quiet human pressure, tension, secrecy, misunderstanding. No dramatic suspects, just people whose lives briefly crossed into Leora's, each with reasons concealed beneath calm surfaces. And the imprint on the wall seems to connect them all indirectly. A silent witness to someone who stood close, paused, hesitated, pressed an object against the paint. Keene leans back, rubbing a tired hand across his jaw. The suspects shift in his mind like shadows cast along uneven ground. No one stands out. No one disappears completely. The truth, he senses, lives somewhere in the ordinary. Something overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it was familiar. He opens the next folder. The investigation deepens. 5 clues emerge slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. 1,000 words. The next morning, rain taps lightly against the precinct windows, soft and repetitive. Keene sits again at the evidence table, a fresh printout of the 7 recovered photographs beside him. He studies the new one, the imprint, letting its quiet shape settle into the forefront of his thoughts. The imprint is faint but deliberate, a circular edge, slightly angled, a smudge from downward pressure. He imagines someone bracing themselves with one hand while holding an object with the other. Why? For what purpose? The emotion behind the gesture becomes more informative than the gesture itself. He begins matching patterns across old statements. In Andrew Klein's interview, he mentioned borrowing Leora's binding tool, a small circular cutter with a metal ring handle, 2 days before she died. He returned it, he claimed, by placing it on her desk the next morning. But the office logs show Andrew arrived late that day. His timeline does not fully align. Keene writes in the margin, "Tool never confirmed as returned." Next, he revisits Mara Delvin's comments about Leora's recent distraction. A neighbor noticing a subtle shift often indicates something internal rather than external. Leora changing her walk, her pace, small behavioral adjustments, suggests she was navigating tension. Not fear, but expectation. The emotional conflict, Keene begins to suspect, existed not at the moment of the crime, but in the days leading to it. He turns to the letters from Ellen Vickers. The 4th letter references a disagreement between them in high school, something never resolved, something we should have talked about sooner. It ends with a line, "I hope the next time we meet we won't avoid the truth again." Innocent on the surface, but context shapes meaning. He underlines the word truth. The missing library book on local symbolism, too, begins to seem less incidental. The circular imprint on the wall resembles a simple symbol used in the folklore illustrations Ellen mentioned. The curve could match the outline of a handheld stamping tool used for marking pages, common in library archives. He writes another note, symbolic connection, personal significance. The pattern deepens when he reviews the maintenance report. Darrell Shaw had described the water damage as older than it looked, suggesting the wall had been damp repeatedly. If someone had pressed a metal object into weakened paint or drywall, the imprint could have been preserved more easily than in intact material. This would place the act not immediately during the fatal moment, but possibly within hours or even days leading up to it. Which means the person who left the imprint might not have intended harm, or might have hesitated. Conflict, not certainty. An emotional conflict. Keene sifts through the timeline again. Leora leaving work early, buying groceries later, the careful placement of her keys on the counter, her curled hand, all small, silent gestures locked in time. He spreads the suspect notes across the table, aligning them carefully. He does not look for guilt. He looks for contradiction. Andrew borrowed tool, unclear return. Mara observed behavioral change, no noise heard. Jonah's alibi solid but geographically close. Ellen, letters referencing unfinished truth, symbolic interests linked to imprint. Darrell, presence at wall, unnoticed observation about her anxiety. He reads each piece again, more slowly this time, letting the emotional tone beneath the facts rise to the surface. Leora was not afraid. She was preparing. She expected someone familiar, someone she trusted enough to let inside. Someone whose presence did not alarm her until something shifted. Keene stops at one line from an early report. Victim's phone records unavailable due to damaged SIM. It had been dismissed as a technical loss, but it creates a gap exactly where clarity should have been. He draws a line connecting 3 elements: the missing book, the imprint, and the behavioral change. A picture begins to form, not complete but coherent. A conflict that was personal, a meeting planned, a conversation that turned slightly, enough for someone to brace themselves against the wall in hesitation or rising emotion. Keene closes his eyes briefly. The clues are not loud. They are quiet, almost tender in their subtlety. They speak not of rage, but of a strained relationship, one that cracked under the weight of years of silence and resurfaced feeling. The circular imprint is not just evidence, it's emotion made physical. A moment caught in the shape of a hand. Keene opens his eyes and studies the list again. For the first time, one name draws his attention more strongly than the rest, not dramatic, not obvious. Just human. He exhales slowly, feeling the narrative threads begin to converge. The inconsistencies, once scattered and faint, now trace the outline of something inevitable. Something just beneath the surface. Something waiting to be recognized. It happens slowly, the way a quiet realization moves through the mind, not in a jolt but in a low, steady shift. Keene sits at the evidence table long past sundown, his posture still, his expression composed. The papers in front of him form a mosaic of possibilities, but now the shapes converge into something unmistakable. The clues, when stripped of urgency and examined through the lens of familiarity, point towards someone who never truly stood out. Someone who blended so entirely into the background of the case that the absence of suspicion became its own disguise. Mara Delvin. The neighbor who claimed to hear nothing. The neighbor who observed Leora's faster walk. The neighbor who described her as distracted, in a tone so neutral it never prompted further questioning. Keene turns Mara's statements over again. Her alibi watching television with the fan running was always accepted without hesitation. Neighbors often anchor investigations simply by proximity, but he notices something now. Her comments about Leora were unusually perceptive. She noticed the shift in pace, the tension in posture, the quick glances, observations that imply a closer level of attention than she acknowledged. He retrieves the older surveillance notes from the time. Mara's windows faced directly toward the short path leading to Leora's front door. If anyone came or left, even briefly, Mara had the best vantage point to notice. Yet she claimed nothing. Keene leans back, letting the room settle around him. The imprint on the kitchen wall remains the central pivot point, the circular edge of something pressed there briefly, unintentionally. The kind of mark left not by a tool of violence, but by something carried out of habit. He flips through the supplemental neighborhood logs. A small detail emerges in a scribbled note from the first responder, neighbor holding flashlight with round casing. Further down the page, she said she used it walking her dog at night. A flashlight. Metal casing, circular edge, about the same diameter as the imprint. Keene closes the folder and exhales through his nose, a controlled breath, not of certainty but of alignment. He revisits the timeline. Mara had mentioned returning from an evening walk before she settled in. The time of that walk was never verified. The assumption was harmless. But if she encountered Leora outside or returned to ask about the misdelivered mail again, the interaction could have lasted only minutes. Enough time for tension to surface. Enough time for a quiet disagreement. Enough time for a moment of emotional strain to leave its shape in a wall. He studies the location of the imprint. Low, angled, as if someone holding a flashlight downward had leaned it against the wall while speaking, perhaps in frustration, perhaps in hesitation. The emotional conflict becomes clearer. Mara lived alone. Her interactions with Leora were limited but observant, a friendly boundary by all appearances. But the more Keene reads, the more he notices the subtle imbalance. Mara knew more details about Leora's routine than a casual neighbor likely would. Not intrusive details, but patterns, rhythm, presence. He returns to the newly discovered image. The imprint's angle places the other person directly facing Leora, standing close, speaking in low tones. Not loud, not aggressive, just close enough for emotion to stir. He imagines the conversation, a disagreement about noise, a misunderstanding about the mail or something unspoken, an expectation, a quiet resentment, a small emotional fracture that widened in the moment. No violence intended, just a slip, a surge of feeling, a sudden push. The kind of action that carries weight without malice. He reads through Mara's 1999 transcript again. There is a paused section highlighted in the margin. Investigator, when did you last speak with Leora? Mara, a while ago, just small talk. Investigator, about. Mara, nothing important. The hesitation, short but real, had never been analyzed deeply. Routine interviews often glossed past these small breaths. People stumble over grief, nerves, fear of implication. But paired with the circular imprint, the letters, the behavior, the timeline, it transforms into something else. Keene stands slowly. He smooths the folder covers, aligning them in a quiet gesture of finality. The truth does not strike him with surprise. It settles with the weight of inevitability. Mara, the quiet neighbor, the one who paid attention without being noticed, had been the last person to see Leora alive. The conflict between them had been private, subtle, unpredictable. A small trigger followed by an irreversible moment. No dramatic weapon, no calculated intent. Just a hesitation that turned into tragedy. The least suspected person. The quietest presence. Keene pulls up the modern address records and confirms that Mara remained in Kentucky for several years, moving only once to a nearby town. No trouble with the law, no documented disputes. A life lived in the same understated way she spoke. A life carrying 26 years of silence. He prepares the report. It is not written with triumph. It is clinical, calm, deliberate, much like the case itself. When the arrest is made 2 days later, Mara sits on her porch, hands resting loosely on her knees. She does not argue, does not protest, does not cry. She simply says in a low, fragile voice, "I didn't mean for anything to happen." The truth emerges the way all quiet truths do, not with spectacle, but with the soft, irrevocable clarity of logic. 7 ends with moral reflection. Truth isn't always visible on surface. 500 words. The house is empty again long after the arrest. Keene stands in the same kitchen where the case first froze in time. The air carries its familiar stillness, the muted scent of dust and dry paint. The imprint on the wall, photographed, measured, documented, remains faint but visible under angled light. It feels less like evidence now and more like a physical memory. He walks slowly through the room, not searching anymore, but acknowledging the quiet weight that lingers in places where truth was delayed. A case doesn't expire because it grows cold. It expires because people stop looking between the lines. The silence here is no longer oppressive. It is contemplative, the kind of quiet that settles after understanding arrives. Not relief, not closure, just understanding. Keene reflects on the layers of the investigation, the suspects who seemed more likely, the motives that appeared stronger, the alibis that felt incomplete, all of it obscured by the natural tendency to search for the loudest explanation, the most dramatic conflict, the clearest path. But truth, he knows now more than ever, rarely travels loudly. It moves through the subtle gestures, the small hesitations, the overlooked details. A circular imprint, a neighbor's too careful phrasing, a pattern of observation disguised as politeness. Mara had lived with her silence for decades, not out of deception, but out of fear. The fear that even the smallest of human mistakes can reshape an entire life. Justice, when it finally arrived, felt mechanical, procedural, necessary. But standing here, Keene feels something beyond procedure, a quiet recognition of the fragile line between intention and consequence. He rests his hand lightly on the worn kitchen counter. The house offers no answers, no apologies. It holds only the echoes of what happened and what could never be undone. The case file will close again soon, this time with resolution. But resolution is not healing. It is simply the numbing of truth. Outside, the evening light fades across the Kentucky hillside. Shadows stretch long and thin, blending into the slow breath of night. Keene watches the dim shapes settle across the yard and thinks about how easily people disappear behind the simplest assumptions. Truth, he realizes, isn't always visible on the surface. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in the quiet neighbor, the unnoticed gesture, the faint imprint on a wall. Sometimes it waits years for someone to look closely enough. He steps outside, pulling the door shut carefully behind him. The sound echoes through the empty house, settling into the corners where time once froze. Something human remains, even as the investigation ends. Not closure, not certainty, just a quiet understanding that something fragile, something deeply human, shaped the truth all along. And that truth, once uncovered, asks only to be seen.